All right, let's dive right into this explainer and unpack the absolutely explosive, wildly consequential life of Alexander the Great. I mean, we're talking about a figure whose chaotic legacy is literally still echoing around us today. We're going to look at the man behind the myth, right? Dissect exactly how this young prince from the shadow of Mount Olympus managed to conquer most of the known world, and then, well, we'll look at the absolute geopolitical earthquake that followed his sudden death.
To map this all out, we're going to break his journey down into 5 parts. 1. A prodigy is born. 2. Master of the battlefield. 3. The crown jewel of Alexandria. 4. Mutiny and death. And finally, number 5, an empire divided.
So let's kick things off with part 1. A prodigy is born, the boy who outsmarted the experts. We begin in Macedonia with a 12-year-old kid who honestly just didn't think or live like anybody else. Born in 356 BCE to King Philip II and Olympias, and eventually tutored by the legendary Aristotle himself, Alexander was told from day one that he was, quite literally, the son of Zeus.
Which brings us to a really fascinating question. How exactly do you tame an untamable horse? Because to understand his precocious brilliance, we have to look at how he answered this. Not with brute force, but with incredibly sharp observation. See, a dealer brought this massive, vicious black horse named Bucephalus to King Philip, and everyone just thought the animal was completely unmanageable. The adult attendants couldn't even mount the guy, let alone ride him.
But here's where it gets really interesting. The historian Plutarch details how a young Alexander completely outsmarted all those adult experts who were ready to just dismiss the beast as useless. Alexander was the only one who noticed that Bucephalus was just terrified of the erratic movements of his own shadow on the ground. It's like a giant puzzle, and he cracked it. By taking the reins, turning the horse to face the sun so the shadow fell behind them, and just speaking gently, he leaped onto its back and took off at full speed. He showed a level of emotional intelligence and tactical awareness that completely baffled the grown men standing around watching.
And this brilliantly illustrates the prophetic realization of his father. Philip II literally shed tears of joy right there on the spot. He saw immediately that Macedonia was just way too small to ever contain his son's ambition. Winning Bucephalus as his prize, Alexander proved right then and there that he had the kind of mind that could see simple solutions where everyone else just saw impossible obstacles.
Moving right along to part 2, Master of the Battlefield, Engineering an Unstoppable Machine. Armed with that boundless ambition we just talked about, and an education from Aristotle, Alexander sets his sights on the absolute powerhouse of the era, the mighty Persian Empire. After his father was assassinated in 336 BCE, a 20-year-old Alexander grabs the throne and just launches this relentless campaign eastward.
Just look at how this builds over a span of less than a decade. He is relentlessly pushing the boundaries of his empire, going from Greece all the way to the Punjab. He crosses into Asia Minor in 334 BCE, completely dismantles the Persian forces at major choke points like the famous Battle of Issus in 333 BCE, sweeps down through Egypt by 331 BCE, where they basically proclaim him master of the universe, and ultimately pushes his armies to the very edges of India by 326 BCE. It is a blistering pace.
And all of that brings us to this staggering number right here, 0. That represents the exact number of battles Alexander lost during 15 years of constant, brutal warfare. Think about that for a second. It's a military record that remains virtually unmatched in human history. To really grasp how he pulled off the impossible, we have to zoom in on his battlefield tactics.
So how exactly did he maintain that perfect record? Well, take the Battle of Issus against King Darius III's massive army. Facing a huge numerical disadvantage, Alexander brilliantly uses the coastal terrain, pinning the Persians right between the mountains and the sea. He completely nullifies their numbers. He sets his heavily armed phalanx infantry in the center like this unmoving brick wall, and then he personally leads his elite companion cavalry in a devastating flanking charge directly at Darius himself. It's a classic hammer and anvil tactic, and it just completely shattered Persian morale.
This whole approach reveals a really fascinating contrast between ancient giants. While someone like Julius Caesar built his loyalty later in life by connecting with his men warmly, calling them comrades, Alexander's leadership was entirely defined by youthful, precocious bravery. He was always leading the vanguard directly into danger. He literally never asked his men to take a risk he wasn't taking himself. And that forged an absolutely unbreakable, even if intensely demanding, bond with his troops.
That brings us to part 3, the crown jewel, Alexandria, Hellenic vision and colonial reality. Okay, so in 332 BCE, Alexander founds what he intended to be this bustling capital bridging the East and the West. Unlike a lot of his conquests, he didn't just want to subjugate Egypt, he wanted to fully integrate it into his massive new Hellenistic world.
But if you look closely at this city, it reveals a profound duality. On one hand, it was an undeniable beacon of Hellenistic scholarship and architecture. But on the other, it was built on a foundation of strict colonialism, where indigenous Egyptians were totally denied civic rights. I mean, you have the stunning 400-foot lighthouse of Pharos, and the great library drawing the absolute finest scientific minds of the age. But beneath that sparkling surface, native Egyptians were conscripted for menial labor and legally prohibited from intermarrying with the ruling Greek and Macedonian elite. It's a very stark contrast.
Which leads us into part 4, Mutiny and Death, the Limits of Ambition. Because despite establishing these incredible cultural hubs, Alexander's relentless drive forward eventually and inevitably collided with the physical limits of his own army. By the time he reached the edges of the known world, his soldiers had been fighting nonstop for nearly a decade.
Let's see how this physical exhaustion rapidly builds towards tragedy. Their grueling victory over Indian war elephants basically broke the army's spirit, and it forced Alexander into a bitter retreat that just decimated his forces. Look, facing King Porus at the Hydaspes River was absolutely terrifying for his men. They won, but they had had enough. They mutinied the Bias River, flat out refusing to take another step east. Alexander was furious, but he was forced to concede. So he leads them on this punishing march back through the Gedrosian desert, taking a massive, deadly toll on the very army that had built his empire.
And then comes the sudden, jarring halt to his unprecedented life. In June 323 BCE, he succumbs to a mysterious fever, with modern theories ranging from malaria to poison, and leaves behind no clear air. He was resting in Babylon, literally planning a brand new expedition into Arabia, and the man who had conquered the world was brought down in a matter of days. He was only 32 years old.
Let's dive into the aftermath in Part 5, An Empire Divided, The Game of Thrones. Almost exactly 40 hours after his final breath, his supposedly unified world just fractured. With no adult heir, he only had an intellectually disabled half-brother and a son who hadn't even been born yet. His massive empire was left totally in the hands of his highly ambitious generals.
Which brings up the million-dollar question, who inherits the world? When asked on his deathbed who should succeed him and rule this massive, sprawling empire, his legendary final answer sparked a devastating global conflict. He just whispered 2 words, the strongest. And man, those 2 words laid bare a totally ruthless mindset, essentially throwing his vast territories up for grabs. Instead of appointing a clear successor to keep things stable, saying the strongest effectively condemned the ancient Mediterranean and Near East to 40 years of relentless, bloody civil war.
Now, what's really wild about this is how almost instantly his generals, known as the Diadochi, turned on each other. It kicks off with Ptolemy orchestrating this bizarre heist of Alexander's body just to legitimize his own rule in Egypt. Perdiccas, acting as regent, was trying to hold the empire together, but Ptolemy recognized the immense symbolic power of Alexander's corpse. By literally hijacking the funeral carriage and diverting it to Alexandria, Ptolemy triggers the first successor war. They were literally fighting over the conqueror's remains. You can't make this stuff up.
As you can see on this map, his former brothers-in-arms rapidly carved up his conquests. They stopped acting like loyal generals and started acting like ambitious rival princes. What was once a unified territory under Alexander split into powerful competing kingdoms. Ptolemy secured Egypt, Seleucus took Mesopotamia and parts of India, Cassander seized Macedonia, and Antigonus claimed Phrygia. The grand dream of one unified Hellenistic world basically died on the battlefield right alongside them.
So the crucial point to leave you with today is this. Is Alexander's true legacy the unified Hellenistic empire he briefly built, or is it the 40 years of brutal, bloody war his death unleashed? Ultimately, we have to weigh the absolute brilliance of his tactical mind against the fragile, chaotic reality of the succession he left behind. He pushed human ambition to its absolute limit, connecting East and West in ways no one had ever seen before. But by refusing to build a sustainable foundation for after he was gone, he guaranteed that his greatest legacy would be written in the chaos of his successors. Definitely something to think about the next time you look at a map of the ancient world. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning history.